Now, we are running tight on time, so with the agreement of the panel and our discussants, I think what I'd like to do is open it up to, let me say, a start of 3 questions. We'll take those on board, and then I will turn to the panelists that they can choose which of those questions they might like to answer, and they can also, at the same time, respond to comments from our 2 discussants. But we've got a short period of time here, so I'm trying to do double duty. So we'll take 1 question here, 1 over there, and then 1 way back to start with. And please put your question forward as opposed to a commentary. So we'll start here, please. Pardon?
Hi, my name is Megan Stephenson from UC Berkeley. I have a question for Carmen mostly. We've been talking a lot about debt this morning, and I'm curious to know, historically speaking, what the effects of default have been on post-crisis recessions, both positive and negative. And I'm curious both about sovereign debt default and also on an individual level, declaring bankruptcy.
Okay, thank you. There was 1 back at the far end, and then 1 over here, please. Yeah, stand up, please. Yeah, in the middle. Yeah, thank you.
It's Adair Turner. I wanted to ask a question to Richard Koo and to Carmen in particular. Richard, I very much agree with you. I think you make a very compelling case that if there hadn't been that fiscal stimulus in Japan, the one would have been in a worse position. And essentially, what you're saying is a familiar story. It goes back to Irving Fisher and the fundamental case of what happens in a debt deflation. My question is this. First of all, what happens now, given the extraordinary scale of public debt to GDP which has resulted? And secondly, if that fiscal stimulus was better than doing nothing, why wouldn't it have been better still to do what Friedman said was the correct policy post facto in the 1930s, which is helicopter money? Why wouldn't a better policy have been for the Japanese government to simply run fully, overtly monetized deficits so that the last 50% of GDP was not in the form of a debt contract held by the Japanese private sector, but was in the form of absolute categoric fiat money? What would have been the disadvantage of that? And I guess the question to Carmen is, you almost hinted that part of deleverage after the Second World War did depend upon a degree of monetization and inflation. Isn't that an inevitable part of getting out of the problems that Japan is now in with its public debt?
Okay, and then we'll take a 3rd question here, and then we'll come back to the panelists and the discussants.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bob Cutton here with the American Prospect. I also found Richard Koo's analysis irreproachable and irrefutable, and yet 99% of right-thinking people in the media, on Wall Street, in government, believe that we can deflate our way to recovery. Someone like Larry Summers last night, not exactly a Bolshevik, doesn't believe that. There was a quote by Keynes from 37 or 38 saying that he could not imagine a democratic country accepting his program in circumstances other than a war. And of course we got the war, and in this country we got the program. World War II was supremely a success for massive Keynesian public investment, even as a byproduct. So my question is, can anyone imagine a politics that can get us outside of Japan to the kind of strategy and program that Richard Koo is recommending?
Okay, thank you very much. So what I'd like to do is go in reverse order, first of all, with the panelists, to either pick up comments that you might have heard from either of our discussants, plus the 3 very good questions. So we'll engage in a bit of a discussion. So I'll start, Alan, with you, then turn to Mario, Richard, Duncan, and then to John and Carmen. So Alan, any thoughts on what you heard from Carmen and John, or in response to the questions from the floor?
Yeah, thank you both. Both are very good comments. Yeah, I was as I admitted, being deliberately mischievous in setting up what was a bit of a false dichotomy. So it's interesting historically. There are obviously episodes, and it actually shows up empirically very strong that the current account really matters in predicting crises before World War II. And I think that's of a piece with our other evidence, that back then, if a country was like building canals or railroads, where's the money going to come from on the margin? It's not going to come from, the financial sectors were very backward then. It's going to come from foreign investors and the money sloshing through into building or overbuilding or whatever. That seems to be less true empirically in the recent period. Now, we've got a mix of episodes. We've certainly got current account deficit countries, US, Ireland, Spain, where a lot of that was flowing through into credit. But if we go back over recent history, we can go back to periods in the 80s where some countries had much smaller current accounts, but they were still able to generate domestic S&L type crises or whatever. So I'm not trying to say that the current account should have no weight, just that we should be very cautious, thinking that if we solve that problem, we're off the hook for financial crises, and I think that's really the only basic point. And the other caveat that I said I might mention was that going forward, if we are going to move towards, it's pick your distortion, border distortions or financial regulation or whatever, but if we're going to move down that track, how quickly we move is an issue. Because if we're still in deleveraging mode for a long time, and we layer on top of that, further messages to the financial sector to basically, recapitalize, tone down leverage, we could be in for, a 10-year creditless, quote, recovery, which will be very painful indeed. So there's obviously a reason, to fade in some of these policy regime changes over time, and that's a challenge facing people like Adair and the BIS and everyone else. How soon do you make these bind soon enough to prevent the next crisis, but not so soon that you kill the recovery? And I think that's an interesting question going forward.
Okay, Mario, let me turn to you to pick up on
I'll comment
what you've heard.
wherever I can. Let me start with the comment on John's comments here, which is that that debate between Hayek and Keynes on the issue of planning or the market or whatever it might be here, I think it was certainly a false dichotomy in the sense that Keynes himself, as he says, right, very much believed in the market mechanism to a large extent. He was a liberal and all that, but he saw the necessity for something out there that would, in a sense, be sure to, or at least ensure over time, that that market doesn't go off on a cliff in some way. And that was the basic concern. In that regard, it was certainly appreciated what that quote was all about. Now, the other question had to do with floating exchange rates. I mean, I've said it many times personally. I mean, actually, if you take the examples right now of Ireland or Greece, they wouldn't be in this problem if they had their own currency in the first place. So it's all because of the fact that they commit themselves now to either fixed exchange rates or to dollarize kind of regimes, in a sense, or the European system, which is a form of it, you could argue. Now, what's the optimal level of integration? That's an issue that we could debate, but it's clear that if we look at the experience of Canada, a floating exchange rate has done us well, I would think. And exactly because it does not put us in a straitjacket. So I totally agree with you on that. Now, on another issue which had been raised about the fiscal policy and the helicopter versus, that's a false dichotomy. I mean, deficit spending is, in a sense, is monetization all the time. It's how the central bank then behaves to clear or sterilize, so to speak, those reserves in the system in order to meet its interest rate policies, period. And there's no such thing as a helicopter, doing this. It's always done through deficit spending, fundamentally, I would argue. Now, the question posed by Bob Kuttner here on the politics of deficit spending. Well, it's interesting. I referred to it at the beginning of my presentation. If you look at the experiences of both the 1930s and today, when the government, other than bailing out, obviously, I mean, there were some emergency sort of issues that had to be dealt with there. But if you look at most governments out there, when they start to implement the fiscal stimulus packages after the end of 2008, what you find is that the real preference was for public investment. And the reason why I think it is that, not something else, is because of exactly the politics of it. Now, one would argue, well, yeah, this actually leads to pork barreling, favoring one group or the other. Well, in fact, it's interesting that public investment, at least in the eyes of the public, the way I see it, is something that all could benefit. I mean, if we build a hospital or whatever it might be, or if we build a bridge or whatever, is something that we at least potentially could all benefit from. And it's not seen in the same way as saying, well, we're going to help those who are on welfare more so because these guys are all lazy or whatever. You get into all the divisive aspects there. And in that regard, I would argue that that has been the way they've actually gone about, and for a very good reason, which is that it's politically the most acceptable way, in that context, to promote growth, while at the same time not being as divisive. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Richard, you've been sitting patiently, so let me turn to you. Carmen raised a couple of issues that you wish to respond to, and a couple of the questions from the floor as well, if you could address, so please.
Okay, the first question from Carmen was Japan going far too slow? And I know that's a kind of common perception around the world that Japan was too slow in getting rid of its non-performing loans and so forth. But I would argue that when the problem is that large, you have to go slowly. And I learned this from none other than Mr. Paul Volcker. I was in charge of Latin American debt crisis at the New York Fed in 1982. And those of you who are old enough to remember how bad that one was, it's as bad as the one we are going through right now. 7 out of 8 US money center banks were said to be bankrupt on August 1982. Everybody from Mexico down to the southern tip of Chile defaulted. And you can imagine how much damage that has done to the American banking system. And those of us at the New York Fed at that time were actually telling the American banks to get themselves out of Latin America from 1979 all the way to 1982, full 4 years. Because in those days, Latin American countries were all run by military dictators, huge current account deficit, huge budget deficit, inflation rate, 3 digits? And American banks kept on lending money. It was the most pathetic thing on earth at the time. But in spite of all our warnings, they kept on lending. And then so in 1982, when it happened that we were proven correct, that our countries do go bankrupt, I got a call from Paul Volcker. Well, I didn't get a call. Someone at the New York Fed got a call from Paul Volcker in Washington. Do everything possible. Literally, everything possible means legal, illegal, paralegal, it doesn't matter. Everything possible to make sure that not a single US bank will pull out of Mexico. Because if one bank pulls out, everyone will pull out, everything will come crashing down, and that's the end of the story. There will be no US banks left on Monday. It was that bad. And I was really shocked as a New York Fed person when just as when we were about to slap the face of American banks, Paul Volcker from the top says, don't slap his face, beg them to stay, continue lending to Mexico. And we did that because we realized that the problem was just far too large for a clean solution like the RTC or the savings and loan. Savings and loan crisis was peanuts, 1/10 of the Latin American debt crisis. And we had to take a long time to clean this thing up because if the entire US banking system is bankrupt, how are you going to recapitalize this thing? And the whole process took about 12, 13 years. And it was done in such a way that average American never felt that there was a banking crisis going on throughout this period. Banks were lending, everything was going as usual. But those of us at the New York Fed who were handling this thing were going literally day by day, whether the Argentina will pay on this evening before 12 o'clock. Everybody was waiting to make sure that Argentina will pay on that day. A couple thousand people at the New York Fed. And given that experience, Paul Volcker actually wrote to the Japanese and said, don't listen to those American cowboys. They don't know what they're talking about. If you have the same problem as we did, and as I said, a whole nation faced the commercial real estate prices down 87%. In a situation like that, all private sector balance sheets are underwater, except people who had no debt whatsoever. And in that case, there would be no buyers. Everybody would be a seller if you force them to dispose their non-performing loans all at once. And so he suggested that Japanese authorities would come up with a speed limit on how fast the bankers are allowed to dispose problem loans. And that's what he did with the Latin American debt crisis. And one guy who overspeeded, Citibank in May of 1987, got massive bashing from Paul Volcker for speeding ticket. And Citibank eventually paid very dearly for that act in 1991. But the point is that when the problem is that large, and if everybody could be a seller and no one's the buyer, asset prices could fall so much and make the correction of the system even that much more difficult. And so, given the systemic nature of the problem in Japan, 87% decline in commercial real estate throughout the nation, I don't think we had any choice. Japanese banks are actually writing off problem loans faster than it is often recognized in the Western press. Because Western press somehow looked at this data from the FSA in Japan, not adjusted for loan loss reserves, and they somehow convinced themselves that Japanese banks are too slow. But when you look at how much loan loss reserves Japanese banks actually put aside, they were doing it much earlier, from 1995, 1996, 1997. That's where the majority of loan loss reserves are actually set aside. But for some reason, lost in translation, right? People just look at this one line that says non-performing loans, and they thought that was the real picture. No, that was not the real picture. The real picture was the Japanese banks were putting aside loan loss reserves very early in the process, but we did not want them to go too fast because that would have collapsed the whole system.
Richard, I'm going to have to cut you off.
And on the fiscal side,
Quickly, please.
Lord Turner mentioned that why couldn't we use the Milton Friedman approach? First of all, in the balance sheet recession, there is a massive increase in private sector savings. And this savings has no place to go except the government bonds, basically, because private sector sources are all deleveraging. Interest rates, even in the earlier part of this exercise, was down to 2% very quickly at 10 years. And eventually it's 1.2% now. In a situation like that, there is plenty of private sector savings to finance the government debt. There's no reason why Bank of Japan should take such crazy risk taking off these government debt, because if you take these government debt, if the Bank of Japan is allowed to dump this at some point when inflation is back, that's fine. But too often, central banks are forced to take this debt, and in that case, when the time is ripe to tighten monetary policy, you cannot get rid of this massive reserves in the banking system any longer. And so for the current instance, after the earthquake, Bank of Japan added 25 trillion to the banking system. And other people have argued that, how about reconstruction bonds of 20 trillion? That's 4% of Japan's GDP, underwritten by the Bank of Japan. And that Bank of Japan refused absolutely. And I think Bank of Japan is doing the right thing, because if you underwrite this 20 trillion, they will not be able to reverse it when the time is ripe. But the 25 trillion that Bank of Japan put in through the quantitative easing, Bank of Japan can always reverse. And that's also true with the Bernanke's QE2. QE2 hasn't destroyed the value of the dollar because everybody knows that when the time is ripe, Bernanke could reverse that thing. But if Mr. Bernanke had to, or the Federal Reserve had to purchase the entire $600 billion US Treasuries and not allowed to sell this later on, then I think that dollar would have collapsed on the spot.
Richard, can I
So the key point is whether the central bank can remain disciplined with, even if adding the liquidity, but they can take the liquidity back after the time is ripe.
Okay, thank you. We are literally down to our last minute, and we have a luncheon speaker. I'm going to, Carmen, give the floor to you to end up. There was a question here around default, so last word to you, and then we'll wrap up.
Very quickly on the default question, private defaults are generally the banking crises. and they're associated with output declines. Public defaults are also associated, or even restructurings. There are very few episodes that you could call strategic ones. Most of them are not strategic, in which defaults don't have an immediate output loss associated. I will say this, re-entry into the capital market is not long forthcoming. It doesn't take 5 years. In many cases, it doesn't even take 3 years. That was not so before World War I. It used to take much longer, but that period has shortened considerably. I just want to put on the table the last commentary. I wasn't implying that they were doing it through monetization. I was indicating that my recent work with Maria Belén Brancia actually quantifies the liquidation of government debt was importantly done through inflation. That wasn't, big spurts, but it was chronic inflation coupled with very low interest rates. I don't have time to discuss that here, but there were a lot of mechanisms put in place, including conversions in the United States in 1951 that took marketable medium and short-term debt and converted it to 29-year non-marketable bonds that kept interest rates low. So let me leave that there.
Okay, well, thank you to our panelists and our discussants. I think we've had a fabulous session. So please join me in thanking them, and we'll bring this to a close. Thank you all very, very much.